What is up, engine heads? It's time for another engine balance video, and in this one we're doing a detailed comparison of the inline 6 engine with different versions of its engine nemesis, the V6. But before we start, just a super quick little recap on primary and secondary engine balance, because understanding this stuff is key to understanding all these engine balance videos. Now, a primary engine imbalance is the result of an unbalanced mass in the reciprocating assembly of your engine. In other words, your pistons are usually the greatest potential source of a primary engine imbalance. An engine with an odd number of pistons is going to have a primary imbalance if the mass of the odd piston isn't balanced out by the other pistons. Secondary engine imbalances occur because the piston travels at different speeds at the top and bottom half of the stroke. It does this because it has to cover a greater distance at the top half than at the bottom half of the stroke. This occurs because although the piston moves in a simple up and down motion, the connecting rod does not. The con rod steps out from a linear path of motion, and because it does this, it pulls down the piston a greater distance during the top half of the stroke. A greater distance means that the piston must travel faster to cover this greater distance. And because of this, there's a difference in speed between the top and bottom half of the stroke. And because there's a difference in speed, there's also a difference in inertial forces between the top and bottom half of the stroke. And this difference in inertial forces is the source of secondary engine imbalance. Now, if you need an easier to understand, a more detailed explanation of secondary engine imbalances, then I suggest that you watch the very beginning of my first video on engine balance. And don't worry if you take a bit of time to wrap your head around this, because nobody really gets it the first time. Also, primary engine imbalances occur once per single engine revolution, while secondary engine imbalances occur twice per single engine revolution. And usually primary engine imbalances are greater in magnitude and more apparent than secondary engine imbalances. Why is engine balance even important? Well, an unbalanced engine is going to run rough and it's going to reduce comfort. Also, a poor engine balance is going to limit performance potential as well as efficiency, and it can negatively impact the lifespan of your engine as well as associated parts like engine mounts, for example. Now let us start with the inline 6-cylinder engine, a beautifully simple and beautifully balanced engine configuration. To see how it's so well balanced, we're going to start by figuring out its firing interval. To do that, we use this very simple formula: 720 divided by 6. 720 is 2 times 360. 360 degrees is, of course, one full single engine revolution. We're doing 2 times 360 because we're talking about 4-stroke combustion engines here, and 4-stroke internal combustion engines need 2 full revolutions for one completed combustion cycle. 1 stroke is 180 degrees, 2 strokes are 360 degrees, and 4 strokes are, of course, 720 degrees. 6 is simply the number of cylinders in our engine. The result is 120, and this tells us that the inline 6-cylinder engine fires every 120 degrees of crankshaft rotation. Now we're going to take 120 and deduct it from 180. 180 degrees is, as we said, one single stroke. The result is minus 60. The minus here tells us that there's power stroke overlap. 60 degrees of power stroke overlap, to be exact. Power stroke overlap is great because it improves engine smoothness. The more power stroke overlap we have, the smoother the engine. So the inline 6 already meets 2 important criteria for good engine balance: an even firing interval and power stroke overlap. What about primary balance? Well, the inline 6 has perfect primary balance because it has an even number of pistons. So the mass of each individual piston can be cancelled out by the mass of another equal piston. Also, unlike the inline 3 or the inline 5, the inline 6 is balanced in relation to its center of gravity, and there is no rocking moment front to back like you can see in the inline 3 or the inline 5. What about secondary balance? Also perfect because in the inline 6, pistons move in pairs, and no single pair is ever at the same part of the stroke as any other pair. When one pair is up, the other pair is down, the third one's going to be in between them, so the forces associated with the different speeds at different parts of the piston stroke cancel each other out. But there's a problem with the inline 6 engine. It's very long, which means it's very hard to stuff it under the hood of a vehicle, especially if you want to mount it transversely. So what do? Of course, you cut it in half and then you mount the 2 banks of 3s into a V shape. And voila, the V6 is born. It's 2 inline 3s in a V shape. It's much shorter than the inline 6, and you can transversely mount it into pretty much anything. well, almost anything. But now there's a new question arising. Because we have a V shape between the two banks, the question is, what kind of angle is the perfect angle for that V shape? And to figure that out, we're going to use again our very simple, useful formula. And because we have again a 4-stroke engine and the same number of cylinders, we have the same formula and the same result, 120 degrees, which was our firing interval. But 120 degrees is also the perfect angle between the two banks of the V in a V6 engine. Why? Well, to understand that, we need to take a closer look at the crankshaft. So here's the crankshaft of an inline 6-cylinder engine. This is the crank pin for piston and rod 1. This is the crank pin for piston rod 2. This is for 3 and 4 and so on until we mount all the rods and pistons onto the crankshaft. As you can see, each rod gets its own crank pin. The inline 6 can do this because the cylinders are mounted one after the other in a line, so there's ample space for each rod to have its own crank pin. Unfortunately, the V6 does not have this kind of luxury. The cylinders sit across each other, they look at each other, which means you need 2 cylinders for 1 crank pin. This means that rods must share a single crank pin. Now, both the V6 and the inline 6, because they have the same number of cylinders, have the same firing interval, 120 degrees. And this is also going to be the angle of separation between each individual crank pins. The only difference is that in the V6, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and 5 and 6 are going to be sharing crank pins, and in the inline 6, nobody's going to be sharing anything. It's just that 1 and 6 are going to be pointing in the same direction, and 2 and 5 and 3 and 4 will be pointing in their respective directions. So here's the typical firing interval of an inline 6-cylinder engine. So we fire cylinder 1, rotate crankshaft 120 degrees, then we fire cylinder 5, then we rotate crankshaft another 120 degrees, then we fire cylinder 3, and so on until we fire everything. The firing interval remains the same. It's always 120 degrees between the firing of each individual cylinder. So that's the inline 6. And the 120 degrees V6 is the same. So it just has a different firing interval, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6. And here's what we do. We fire cylinder 1, and then we rotate 120 degrees. And this is where the bank angle of 120 degrees comes into play. Because the bank angle is the same as the firing interval and the same as the crank pin separation angle, it means that once we fire cylinder number 1 and rotate crank 120 degrees, cylinder number 2 is going to be right close to TDC, ready to be fired. So we can fire it. So we do 1, 120 degrees rotation, we fire 2, 120 degrees rotation, we fire 3, and so on until we fire everything. So the 120 degrees V6 is great. It enables an even firing interval and the same power stroke overlap as an inline 6. It's a great engine, right? Well, actually no, the 120 degrees V6 is useless and stupid. It's useless and stupid because the whole point of developing a V6 engine is to make it more compact than an inline 6. But with 120 degrees between the cylinder banks, you're actually making an engine that's almost as wide as a flat 6, but it's taller than a flat 6, so it's everything except compact. It's a very bulky engine, and this is why you don't really see it in mass production cars. You can only see it in LeMans or F1, although recently Aston Martin teased their TM01 engine, which seems to have a very wide angle between the two banks of the V6, although I'm not sure if it's really 120 degrees. We'll see. So the 120 degrees V6 is impractical. How do we make it more practical, more compact? Of course, we reduce the bank angle. How about 90 degrees, just like a V8? The added bonus is we can make it on the same production line as a V8. We just chop off the last 2 cylinders. Well, that's exactly what Buick did in 1961 for the first generation of their fireable V6 engine. They derived it from their 215 cubic inch V8 engine. The only difference between the blocks was there was 2 cylinders less and the crankshaft was different. Of course, they used the same shared pin crankshaft we just described in our 120 degrees V6. And the result was a very rough, odd firing engine. So what is an odd firing engine? Well, I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't even firing. It wants to be even firing, but it can't. To see why it can't, let's observe the first generation 1961 Buick Fireball in action. So here's the representation of that engine, the engine block, here's the cylinder numbers, and here's the firing interval, and here's what each cylinder is doing at a particular moment in time. As you can see, the firing interval is kind of weird. Now, to better explain things, we're going to start from the end of the firing interval, from cylinder number 2. So let's fire cylinder number 2, and then let's rotate 120 degrees because we want to try and maintain an even firing interval. So we fire 2, rotate 120 degrees, and we should fire 1 next, but we can't because we just skipped TDC of 1. We just missed our opportunity to fire cylinder number 1. Why? Well, because our bank angle isn't 120 degrees, it's 90 degrees. The bank angle dictates when opposing cylinders in a V engine are going to be seeing TDC. So in a 90-degree V6, when one cylinder fires and the crankshaft rotates, it needs to rotate the same amount of degrees as the bank angle for the opposing cylinder to reach TDC. So let's take it from the top. Again, we obviously can't do 120 degrees. We need to fire cylinder 1. So let's do, we fire 2, we rotate 90 degrees, that's our bank angle again, and voila, 1 is at TDC now, we can fire it. So we fire cylinder 1. Let's try to fire the next cylinder. We should fire 6 next, right? But how much should we rotate? Well, let's try rotating 90 again. Let's try to keep an even firing interval. But guess what? We can't fire anything. Let's try 3. Well, 3 is actually just going to TDC of exhaust stroke. It needs another 30 degrees to reach TDC of exhaust. We obviously can't fire that. What about cylinder number 4? Well, this is doing intake and it finished exhaust some 60 degrees ago, so we can't fire that either. Let's try cylinder number 5. That is in compression, right? We might be able to fire that, but well, obviously we can't fire that. It's very low down in the bore, as we can see, and it needs another 150 degrees to reach TDC of compression. What about cylinder number 6? Well, that is pretty close to TDC of compression, but it needs another 60 degrees to reach TDC of compression. So what do? Well, we're forced to rotate another 60 degrees to fire cylinder number 6. So let's do that. We fire 2, we rotate 90, we fire 1, and then we rotate 90, and then we rotate another 60 to fire cylinder 6. And we just made a boo-boo. Why? Because our first firing interval was 90 degrees, and then our next is 90 plus 60. That's 150. That means our firing interval is 90, 150, 90, 150, which means it's odd. It isn't even like 120, 120, 120, 120. An engine naturally wants to have equal spacing between each firing event. If it doesn't have that, it runs rough. So our shared crankpin V6, which has 90 degrees between the two cylinder banks, ends up being forced to have an odd firing interval because its bank angle is unequal to the naturally desired even firing interval of the engine, as well as the separation angle between the individual shared crankpins. As you can see, what's missing from the bank angle ends up being reflected on the firing interval. The missing 30 degrees from the bank angle are tossed between individual firing interval instances. Now, the gist of all of this is that an odd firing V6 is never going to be as smooth as an even firing V6, and this is exactly what Buick realized as well in 1977, so they decided to fix it, and they fixed it by making a 90-degree V6 that was also even firing. How did they do that? Well, let's think about it ourselves. Where can we make up for the wrong bank angle? What can we sacrifice? That shared crankpin, of course. We can make up for the wrong bank angle in the shared crankpin by making it a non-shared crankpin. Let's turn the shared room arrangement into individual rooms. Let's split the shared crankpin in half and offset it. By how much should we offset it? By whatever number of degrees is missing from that bank angle. So if our bank angle is 90, that means we're missing 30 degrees. And that means our offset angle between the now split crank pins should be 30 degrees as well. And this angle is called the split angle, and it makes up for whatever is missing from the bank angle, and it saves the day. It enables an even firing interval 90-degree V6. Thanks to the split angle, when we fire a cylinder in this cylinder bank and rotate the crankshaft 120 degrees, the cylinder in the opposing bank is now at TDC. It's ready to be fired. We're no longer skipping the opportunity to fire the other cylinder. We now have a compact V6 that has an even firing interval and a power stroke overlap, just like an inline 6, but smaller. But we can squeeze even more benefits out of this split angle thing. We can make the V6 even smaller, even narrower. Let's do a 60-degree V6. We're just going to make up for it in the split angle. So if the bank angle is 60, it means we're missing 60 degrees more to 120. So let's make a 60-degree split angle. Yeah, cool. Well, I know what you're thinking. Look at this cross section between the offset crank pin halves. It's kind of small. This means this is a weak crankshaft, right? Well, yes it is, but we can fix that. We can do what Alfa Romeo did in their Busso V6 engine. We can put flying arms between the offset crank pin halves, and what we just got is a narrow compact V6 that has an even firing interval, power stroke overlap, and a strong crankshaft. It's a quadruple win. So with a bit of engineering, we finally managed to fix the firing interval problem while still retaining the compact nature of the V6. But what about the primary and the secondary balance? Well, to understand that, let's recall the inline 3-cylinder engine. It has a primary imbalance in relation to its center of gravity, and therefore it has a rocking moment front to back. But the inline 6-cylinder engine has perfect primary balance. How come? Well, it's two inline 3s mirroring each other. So the two inline 3s in the inline 6 cancel each other's rocking moment out, and the inline 6 has perfect primary balance. But the V6 isn't like this. There's no mirroring of inline 3s. Instead, the inline 3s are in opposing banks, which means that each bank of the V6 actually has the primary imbalance of an inline 3-cylinder engine. How do we fix it? Balancing shafts, of course, because we're fixing a primary imbalance. We need a single shaft rotating at the speed of the crankshaft, and you can often find balancing shafts like this in the V6 engine, but we don't like balancing shafts. They add friction, weight, and cost. Let's do something else. Again, let's look to the Alfa Romeo Busso V6. It doesn't have balancing shafts. Instead, it uses the flywheel and the crankshaft pulley, because these two things rotate at the speed of the crankshaft. All you gotta do is incorporate an offset weight into these two items and you get rid of your primary imbalance. In fact, the Alfa Romeo V6 is one of the first engines using this sort of method to get rid of a primary imbalance in a V6 engine. So what about secondary balance? Well, again, let's look at an individual inline 3-cylinder engine. And as you can see, it has no problems with secondary balance. We have 3 cylinders, 3 pistons, but each of the pistons is in different parts of the stroke, which means that they cancel the difference between the different inertial forces associated with different speeds at the different parts of the stroke, because all the pistons are in different parts of the stroke at different times. So a single inline 3-cylinder has no issues with secondary balance, and a V6 is 2 inline 3s in opposing banks, which means that neither bank has issues with secondary balance, which means that the V6 doesn't have any issues with secondary balance. And there you have it. We have witnessed how engineering has turned the V6 from something bulky and rough to something compact and smooth that can rival the inline 6-cylinder engine. The added bonus of the V6 is that it has a shorter, more rigid block, and it also has a shorter crankshaft, which doesn't experience as much torsion or twisting force as the long crankshaft of the inline 6-cylinder engine. Although we have many modern inline 6-cylinder engine designs that testify to the fact that, with the right engineering and the right amount of materials and the right at the right places. Block flexing due to the block's length or crankshaft twisting really isn't an issue on modern inline 6-cylinder engines. On top of this, an inline 6-cylinder engine just needs one cylinder head as opposed to a V6 that needs two cylinder heads. So yeah, there you have it. Now that we have explored the V6, I plan to compare the inline 6 with the V6, with the VR6, and then with the flat 6 in our future engine balance videos. So stay tuned for that in case you want to find out how they fare against each other. As always, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon with more fun and useful stuff on the D4A channel.